welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Debbie Watts and this is acrylic card art. The card we will be making today is going to be using some simple techniques, Distress Oxides, some stamping and just card distressing. I'm also going to be using, as well as ink pads to stamp with, acrylic paint, so it just gives a texture to the card. So what are we making today? So here you can see this wonderful new home card. It can obviously be any occasion at all. So let's just talk through. So this, first of all, we're going to be creating the background card. This was white paper, white cardstock, sorry, and we've just added 3 different colours of oxides. Choice is yours, of course. We'll go through the colours that I've used, but we've got peacock feather, we have got dried marigold, and we have got twisted citron. So then I've taken a stamp set. Today I've used flowers. Again, it could be any flower design. You don't have to stick with this. Just use what you've got in your craft stash. And I've then created some imaging. You can see probably there's some texture. Let's see if I can pick that up. And this is where I've actually stamped in acrylic paint. So you might think, that's a bit unusual, but it's really nice and give it some interest to your card. I've then stamped a simple sentiment. I've splattered the card, as you can see, with white acrylic, and then I've matte and layered the card. Interesting finish here, you'll see. It's not the perfect finish, it's what I call a distress edge. So I'll show you how we're going to achieve that. You basically do your work, rip it up, and then stick it on your card. You might be horrified, but I think it's a really nice finish to the card. So let's just talk through some of the materials that you'll need so you too can achieve this card today. To run through the inks that we're going to use today, I'm going to be using the Distress Oxides, always a favourite of mine, and pick up whatever colours you want, but for my colour scheme today I will use the peacock feathers, the dried marigold, and the twisted citron. So I have a sponge for every colour, and it just, but as you can see in storage they tend to bump into each other, so just be careful that you're not going to get that contaminated onto your work. Before I start work, I tend to take off the surplus ink on the sponges before I store them as well. It doesn't prevent contamination, as you can see, a couple of bumps on there with the other sponges, but I like to just take off as much surplus ink before storage and after use as well. So one colour I always have in reserve, and I end up with my cards just having a hint of this colour, is one of my favourites, and that's the picked raspberry. So we'll see whether the card is actually going to, this is going to make an appearance on the card today. So I'll just run through the other products that you'll need as well. So today the card is going to be using this Creative Chaos from Visible Image. I'm not endorsed at all for using this or promoting it, or it's just one that I have in my collection that usually finds its way onto quick cards that I make. I think the images are quite versatile, very versatile indeed. I stamp with the VersaFine Clair, and as you can see I've got the black and I've got the Morning Mist, which is like a dark pale grey. So sometimes when I'm stamping, I find that if you stamp in black, then the image can be quite stark. And sometimes for the grey, I just want a softer finish to the stamped image. So this Morning Mist is just perfect for that. So let's just run through the acrylic blocks that you'll need for stamping. I've got a couple of sizes here. I use the grid ones, and it just makes it easier for me. Personal preference, it's not a must, so if you haven't got them, don't go out and buy them. It's just the plain ones are equally as effective, so it's just to say personal preference. Helps me keep a straight eye when I'm trying to stamp and line things up. Doesn't always work, but every little helps. I seem to find myself. So the small one, it's important that the size of your stamp is actually going to fit your block. And what I mean by that, as you can see, that fits quite perfectly. So that's going to help in the stamping process for a clean, crisp image. If you're using a big block for a smaller stamp, what I tend to find, it could be how I'm using the products, but I tend to not get a clear, crisp stamped image. Sometimes it's blurred. Now, whether that's because I'm putting too much pressure or that process of rocking distorts the image, so that's why I tend to fit the block to the size of the stamp. And I've got a variety of these. So for the smaller stamp, I'm going to use this tiny acrylic block. Just a couple of other products. I will be using this splatter brush. Now this can get quite messy, but one of the finishing touches I want to put to this card would be to splatter some white acrylic paint over the final image, and I tend to find that this is just perfect for that action. It's quite a stiff brush. You can get the same if you use a paintbrush and tap the brush, but again, this helps me just to have a better aim. I've got a white highlighter acrylic pen, so I just want to put a couple of finished touches with that. Also, I'm going to be using this white acrylic paint. Sorry, it's got a bit of glare on it. And I often stamp with acrylic paint as well, so not just your ink pads. And I find that it gives you a texture finish, really, really nice finishing touch. And I'm going to just be stamping in the same. This is a silver acrylic paint, and again, just to give some accent and textures to the card once it's finished. I think it's going to look quite special. And finally, the cardstock. Today's card will be a 15 by 15 centimetre base scored white card. I'm then going to layer with a black card. This one is 14 by 14 centimetres. And the main image and work that I'm going to be using is just a white piece of card. So I've cut this 15 by 15 centimetres, and you may be thinking, well, what's the point of cutting it larger than your matte layers? So I've got 15 by 15, 14 by 14, and 15 by 15. So yes, I'm a bit crazy, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to rip distress each of the 4 edges on this once I've created and coloured this base card in, the layer card in, because I just want to give it a bit of a distressed edge. Sometimes I don't like all my cards to be exact, perfect, pristine cuts. So yes, I'm going to put loads of work into this, and then I'm going to rip it up. But trust me, the effect will be absolutely amazing. When I'm actually holding the card to put the distress ink on, because of oil and fingerprints, I don't really want to contaminate my work. So I take a piece of scrap paper and just hold the edge of the card whilst then I'm adding the ink to the other areas of the page. And then that way, as I say, you're not going to put your fingerprints into the ink, because the oils in your skin will actually take off the colour of the oxide ink. So that's just another top tip for you. So as you can see, I'm using each of the colours that I've chosen just to add the ink to the card to create a crazy background. Again, fingers on your spare piece of paper to avoid your fingerprints on the card. So once you've completed your background card, just to remove all of the ink pads, as you can see, there's quite a lot of ink on my work surface. So with a wet tissue, I'm just going to rub that off so it's nice and clean, and take my hand towel. This way everything stays really clean and really dry, and I'm not going to end up with wet soggy cardstock, and I'm certainly not going to end up with contaminated cardstock either. So once you've finished distressing the edge, rip distressing, what we're going to do now is take our stamp set and our VersaFine Clair and our acrylic block, and we are going to start stamping the design and images to your background card. So just remember, if you haven't got the perfect fit of a stamp, that you know your block is slightly too small, then you can twist the block and then just simply affix your stamp on a diagonal. So your block doesn't have to be square. You can actually stamp it and perfectly fit a slightly larger stamp than block to your block quite easily. Taking your VersaFine Clair ink pad to your stamp onto the block, just make sure that you've got plenty of ink onto your stamp. If you've got a stamping platform, then obviously you can repeat stamp to exactly the same position, but see here we're just using the acrylic block, so just make sure you've got a really good coverage of ink to your stamp. Okay, so as you can see, here I have put some ink onto the block, and before I actually do, so that it doesn't come off, I'm going to just wipe that off the block, and then I know I'm not at risk of that part of the block accidentally rocking onto the surface of my background card. So take your acrylic block to your paper, position it, and then what you want to do is just lightly push and put some light pressure to the areas of your stamp. Be careful not to rock the block, and again, that's really why it's important that if I have inked the block at all, I've wiped it before I've actually done the stamp transfer. So let's just make sure I've got some good ink connection to my artwork, and then just gently lift. As you can see, it's a fantastic stamp set. So just let's start to create a scene on this background. So reposition your next image where you want it on your work, and again, just some light pressure. And as you can see, I've not actually put the entire stamp onto the card, so I'm stamping off of the card. Okay, and as you can see, I'm using the distress of the edge to continue the image down. Just make sure here you're just keeping your work surface nice and clear and dry, and you're not at risk of fingers going into that and end up with dirty fingers onto your work. I'm just going to use the two larger flowers on here. I don't want it to be over busy, but in this stamp set there is a smaller flower. So taking the Morning Mist Versifying Clay, I'm just going to ink up the smaller stamp, okay, because I don't want this flower to be as prominent on my card as the larger flowers. So just make sure you've got plenty of ink. So again, just position it and light pressure. And as you can see, the grey image, the grey ink, stamps perfectly the same. And I've just got a more faded colour of the image. So it's actually trying to create some distancing as well on the card. So ink up another image and place it on your card. Give it some firm pressure and lift. As you can see on that one, I didn't ink it perfectly well, so what I'll do is I will get a grey pen and just infill that line in, so you won't actually see that I've made a mistake. So as you can see, I've just used a grey watercolour pen. Doesn't have to be a watercolour, just to infill where I hadn't stamped, and you wouldn't know the difference. Once I've finished my flower stamping, I'm going to use some of the other images in the stamp set and stamp away. So again, take your ink pad to the stamp and make sure you've got some really good coverage, and take your stamp to your work and stamp away. I'm not going to cover all of the image, so every time you use it, you'll stamp again, just re-ink. So I'm just going to stamp some of the other images randomly to the work. I want to try to leave the flowers quite unique, because I think actually I want to do some layering of those flowers. So I just want to create a second stamp flower head for both of the larger flowers and the smaller ones on a separate piece of cardstock, and I think that's where my pink will come in quite nicely. So just build up your images. Don't forget, we don't have to just use the black ink pad. I'm going to use the grey ink pad as well. So I'm not using the exact same section of the stamp all the time. I'm just randomly stamping. Too much or too little, really the choice is yours. Utilise the stamp set as much or as little as you want to, and put as much or as little detail as you want to. I mean, this is all about you personalising the card for you. But I think, you know, this stamp set is absolutely amazing, and the detail that it actually prints and stamps is just beautiful. So I mentioned earlier that I don't always stamp with my ink pads. So I've taken some of the acrylic paint, the metallic one here, and I've put a blob on my glass mat, and with my tissue I'm just going to dab that, as you can see, to create it as flat as I can. And I'm then going to take my stamp, okay, and rather the ink pad to the stamp for coverage, I'm going to put the stamp into that while it's still wet. Just give it a tap, pick up the acrylic paint, as you can see, the stamp is covered, and I'm just going to then stamp some of this randomly over the card. As you can see, that's left a nice texture on the card. So again, just pick up some more, treat that as an ink pad, and then stamp on your card. Sorry if the camera's all over the place. You don't have to push very firmly, and just be careful that because this is wetter than an ink pad, your stamp, you don't push too firmly, because you might end up with a smudge and a slide as the wet paint moves across the surface. So just a very light pressure. As you can see, that's going to leave some really great textures on that once that's dry. So to dry that, you could use a heat gun, or you could just pop it to one side for I'd say maybe 20 minutes or so, and just make sure that dries itself. So when you are using your stamps in acrylic paint, it's important that, as you can see, they get quite messy. So it's important that you just wash them with warm soapy water as quickly as possible. If you allow them for the acrylic paint to dry, then it's just going to ruin your stamp. So I'm just going to wash those now. So as you can see, they're nice and clean again. It's important that you take the acrylic paint off of your stamps. As you can see, this one has got some of the ink pad ink. This is fine. That's not going to distort your image going forward. But if that was acrylic paint, it's really important to make sure that you've got all of that washed off. Look after the stamps, and obviously they'll be ready to use for many years to come. These are polymer, so it's important that you actually keep them out of sunlight. I always store them in the original packaging, and always on the acetate sheets that they come on. So again, don't worry too much if you can't get this in, but please make sure that you take off all of your acrylic paint off of your stamps. To you earlier that we were going to put some splatter effect on this card, so I've just finished cutting out and shaping the flower heads, and use the rollable to give it some texture and dimension. So I've placed on my craft mat some acrylic white paint, taken my splatter brush, and I just really want to randomly splat onto the card. So I'm going to expand the bristles and flick them back so I get splatters onto the actual card itself. Stamping the sentiment and affixing the flower heads to the card, I think, you know, from this was a white piece of card earlier, how amazing all the different colours look. Personal, I do like the pink contrast of those colours. You may not want to add colour at all, you may want them just to be white, but Again, this is all about personal preference and me just giving you some inspiration for a card that you can make. It doesn't have to be this stamp set, you can have any stamp set. Again, just use your imagination with what you have at home. So for this card, the flower head that I've layered, I just want to put some of the sparkle pen. This is a clear sparkle pen, and just want to jazz up the flower head. So I will just add some of the sparkle all over the flower head, and make sure I don't get any on the base card. Maybe I should have done this before I fixed it into place. So maybe that's a top tip for you. I'm just doing it back to front. So again, just want to pick up some of the sparkle on that. I'm just going to do the same with the other. So to prime these pens, you just give it a bit of a squeeze. If you think that the brush is drying out, just make sure that you don't squeeze it too much and you end up with your clear glitter pen all over your work. So again, just adding some detail there, as you can see that sparkle does make a difference. Keeping it to the flower head. So do the smaller ones, being extra careful not to get this on to your background card. So again, it's just to add some sparkle. So leave that to dry and we'll come back to it in just a second. So we've made the card. I hope you think it wasn't too difficult. This is really just an inspirational tutorial for you. Please have a look through what you've already purchased. Try to use what you already have. And sometimes when we're looking, we find those things that we forgot we had. So this is a really good way to really research what you already have in your craft stash. Change the colours. You don't have to use the exact ones that I've used today. Change the stamp, change the design. But I think you can understand the concept of the tutorial that I've given you today, and you can achieve as equally such as a wonderful card like this. So final words from me. It's important for me that you enjoy yourself. It's important that you've learnt something today, even if it's just blowing the cobwebs off of the skills you have and refreshing the memory. So a couple of important things that I could just ask for you to do is just like, subscribe to my channel for any future videos that I will be releasing very soon. And most important is just to relax and enjoy crafting. All too often we stress, and crafting is not about being stressed. And we make a couple of accidents along the way, but hey, it's just card, it's just ink, and those can be corrected, and you just simply start again. So thank you ever so much for watching me today. I've really enjoyed making this card and I hope you have too. So like, subscribe and leave a comment, and until the next time, my final words are happy crafting.